and the mind behind the weapon, the MP34, and the engineers who refined early submachine warfare. The workshop in Steyr was silent that winter morning in January 1933, save for the rhythmic tap of Theodor Bergmann's pencil against the iron workbench. Before him, blueprints sprawled like maps of an undiscovered country, technical drawings of what he believed would reshape modern warfare. The MP34 prototype rested nearby, its barrel catching the pale Austrian sunlight that filtered through frosted windows. Cold steel, precise tolerances, a weapon nobody wanted to believe in. Bergmann's hands, scarred from a decade of metalwork and still missing 2 fingers from a mortar blast in 1916, traced the weapon's profile. Vertical magazine, simplified bolt mechanism, chrome vanadium barrel with radial cooling perforations. Every line, every measurement represented years of quiet obsession, and the certainty that conventional military thinking was catastrophically wrong about the future of combat. Outside, snow blanketed the mountains. Inside, the weight of institutional resistance pressed down like winter itself. 3 weeks earlier, General Victor Kienbuck had dismissed the MP34 with a wave of his hand. The meeting at the Austrian High Command had lasted exactly 11 minutes. Bergmann remembered every word. "Rifle Mannlicher has a range of 800 meters, the general had said, not even looking at the prototype. Your toy is useful for what? 50 meters? Bergmann had taken a breath, choosing his words carefully. Modern war won't be decided at 800 meters, sir. It will be decided in trenches, bunkers, city blocks. In those spaces, 1 man with this is worth 10 with rifles." The general's expression had hardened. "That's tactical heresy, Herr Bergmann." "No, sir, that's reality. You just weren't there to see it." The room had gone cold. Within minutes, Bergmann was escorted out, his prototype under his arm, his career in military consultation effectively over. But he'd been right before, and he knew he was right now. The Great War had proved it in blood and mud. The problem was convincing people who'd never crawled through a trench that everything they believed about infantry combat was obsolete. The door to the workshop opened. Louis Schmeisser entered, stamping snow from his boots, carrying 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the frigid air. The German expatriate had worked with Hugo Schmeisser on the original MP18. He knew automatic weapons better than anyone Bergmann had ever met. "Still brooding?" Schmeisser asked, setting 1 cup beside the blueprints. "Calculating," Bergmann corrected. "Same thing for you." Franz Janicek arrived moments later, the Czech machinist who'd spent 15 years perfecting magazine feed systems. He looked at the prototype, then at Bergmann's face, and understood immediately. They said no again. They said it's impossible. That doctrine doesn't support it, that the Mannlicher is proven. Schmeisser snorted. The Mannlicher is proven to get men killed in close quarters. But doctrine doesn't count corpses. Bergmann picked up the MP34, feeling its weight. 4 kilograms, perfectly balanced. The weapon felt inevitable in his hands, like holding the answer to a question the world hadn't learned to ask yet. "We run the endurance test today," he said quietly. 2,000 rounds continuous. If the barrel holds, we have our proof. "And if High Command still refuses?" Janicek asked. Bergmann set the weapon down with careful reverence. "Then we keep refining it until reality forces them to listen." Wars don't care about doctrine, they care about what works. What Theodor Bergmann didn't know that morning, what none of them could have known, was that their obsession with perfecting a weapon nobody wanted would reshape infantry tactics across 3 continents, that the MP34 would save thousands of lives and end thousands more, that 5 years later the workshop itself would be seized, the weapon mass-produced under a flag Bergmann despised, and his life's work would become a tool of conquest he'd tried desperately to prevent. But that morning there was only cold metal, precise engineering, and the unshakable belief that being right mattered more than being believed. The firing range awaited. If stories like this make you question what you do when everyone says you're wrong, but you know you're right, tell us in the comments and stay with us for the next chapters. How do you prove the impossible when the only evidence that matters is written in casualties nobody wants to count? The problem had begun 15 years earlier, in trenches that turned men into ghosts. Theodore Bergman had been 24 years old when the Great War found him on the Italian front in 1914, a conscripted soldier who'd never wanted to fight, carrying a Mannlicher rifle he respected as engineering, but knew was wrong for the war they were actually fighting. The rifle was magnificent at 400 meters across open ground, but the war wasn't being fought across open ground. It was being fought in mud-filled corridors carved into mountainsides, in concrete bunkers barely wider than a man's shoulders, in the kind of intimate, suffocating violence where 800 meters of range meant nothing. He'd watched men die reloading, watched them struggle with bolt-action mechanisms while enemies closed the distance, watched conventional doctrine, fire discipline, marksmanship, controlled volleys, collapse into desperate chaos the moment combat moved indoors. The Germans had developed the MP-18 submachine gun as a brutal answer. Automatic fire, close range, overwhelming volume. It was crude, heavy, unreliable. But in trench raids, it was devastating. Bergman had never fired one in combat. A mortar fragment had ended his war in 1916, taking 2 fingers and sending him home to Vienna with a medical discharge and nightmares about men dying while fumbling with rifles designed for a war that no longer existed. But he'd seen the future, and he couldn't forget it. Now, 17 years later, he sat in the Steyr workshop as winter dawn broke over Austria, holding that future in his hands. The MP34 wasn't just an improved MP18, it was a complete rethinking. Where the MP18 used the awkward, failure-prone TM08 drum magazine, the MP34 used a simple vertical box magazine, 32 rounds, spring-fed, reliable. Where the MP18's cooling system was primitive, the MP34's chrome vanadium barrel with radial perforations could handle sustained fire without warping. Where the MP-18 jammed in mud and cold, the MP-34's simplified bolt mechanism kept functioning. Schmeisser had contributed the recoil system, a stroke of genius that reduced muzzle climb and kept the weapon controllable, even in full automatic. Janicek had perfected the magazine spring tension, solving the feed failures that plagued earlier designs. Together, they'd created something that worked. Now they had to prove it to people who didn't want to believe. The endurance test began at 800 hours, with all 3 men present, and a military observer from the Austrian Ordnance Department, a young lieutenant named Stefan Horvath, who'd been sent to document what his superiors expected to be a spectacular failure. Bergman loaded the first magazine himself, his 3 remaining fingers and thumb moving with practiced efficiency. He'd learned to work around the missing digits years ago. The weapon seated perfectly, the metallic click sharp in the cold air. 2,000 rounds, he said. Continuous fire in 200-round intervals. We stop only to reload. Horvath made a note, his expression skeptical. The barrel will warp by round 500, he said. Hugo Schmeisser's own tests showed. Hugo Schmeisser didn't have chrome vanadium alloy and thermal dispersion perforations, Schmeisser interrupted. We're not repeating his work, we're finishing it. The first magazine emptied in 4 seconds. The sound was sharp, controlled, not the wild roar of the MP-18, but something more precise, more surgical. Bergman's hands stayed steady despite the recoil, the weapon tracking true. Janicek loaded the second magazine, then the third, fourth, 5th. By round 400, Horvath had stopped taking notes and started watching intently. By round 800, his skepticism had shifted to something else. Not quite belief, but the beginning of doubt about his own certainty. By round 1200, the barrel was hot but holding. No warping, no failure. Bergman's shoulder ached. His ears rang despite the cotton plugs, but the MP34 kept firing, kept functioning, kept proving that what everyone said was impossible was simply true and waiting to be recognized. At round 2000, the final magazine clicked empty. Bergman set the weapon on the bench, steam rising from the barrel in the frozen air. He touched the chrome vanadium steel carefully. Hot, but not deformed, the radial perforations had done their work. Horvath stared at the weapon, then at the pile of spent casings, then back at the weapon. "I need to report this," he said quietly. "Will they listen?" Janček asked. Horvath's silence was answer enough. That night, alone in his small apartment in Steyr, Bergman sat by the window and thought about his father, a watchmaker who'd taught him that precision wasn't about perfection, but about understanding tolerances, about knowing which hundredth of a millimeter mattered and which didn't. His father had died in 1929, never knowing that his son had taken those lessons about springs and gears and applied them to weapons. Bergman wondered if the old man would have been proud or horrified. Probably both. The rejection letter arrived in March 1933, 2 months after the successful endurance test. Bergman read it 3 times, standing in the workshop while melting snow dripped from the eaves outside. The language was bureaucratic, polite, and absolute. The Austrian High Command appreciates the technical achievement demonstrated by the Steyr MP34 prototype. However, current infantry doctrine does not support adoption of automatic weapons for general issue. Funding for further development is declined. Schmeisser found him an hour later, still holding the letter. They said no. They said doctrine doesn't support it. Doctrine didn't support tanks either, until tanks started winning battles. Bergman set the letter down carefully as if it might shatter. "We're out of funding. High Command won't pay for more tests. And without official backing, we can't access military firing ranges or get battlefield evaluations. So we stop?" The question hung in the cold air. Bergman looked at the MP34 resting on the workbench. Cold steel and chrome vanadium precision, a weapon that worked despite everyone's certainty it couldn't. He thought about the men he'd watched die in Italian trenches, fumbling with bolt-action rifles. He thought about the next war, the one everyone knew was coming, and the soldiers who would die because doctrine refused to adapt. "No," he said quietly, "we don't stop. We refine." What they couldn't know was that history was already accelerating toward them. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor in January. In Austria, the Dollfuss government was tightening its grip, caught between fascism and democracy. In workshops and laboratories across Europe, other engineers were working on their own automatic weapons, the Germans continuing Schmeisser's MP18 lineage, the British experimenting with the Lanchester, the Soviets developing what would become the PPD. The race to perfect submachine warfare had begun, whether doctrine acknowledged it or not. Janček brought news in April. A private industrialist in Vienna was willing to fund limited production, 20 prototype MP34s, if they could demonstrate reliability in field conditions, not official military trials, but civilian marksmanship competitions and police evaluations. "It's not what we wanted," Janček said, "but it's something." They built the 20 prototypes over 3 months, working late into spring nights when the workshop windows stayed open and the smell of machine oil mixed with alpine air. Each weapon was hand-fitted, each tolerance checked personally by Bergman, each magazine tested hundreds of times. In July, Austrian police units in Vienna tested the MP34 in urban scenarios. Room clearing, crowd control simulations, close-quarters accuracy drills. The reports came back enthusiastic. Officers loved the weapon's controllability, its reliability, its stopping power at short range. High Command ignored the reports. "They don't want to be wrong," Schmeisser said one night, frustration cracking his usual calm. "It's not about the weapon, it's about admitting they misjudged." Bergman understood. He'd spent years watching pride override evidence, watching institutional inertia crush innovation, watching men die because changing doctrine meant admitting past doctrine was flawed. But understanding didn't make it easier. His wife, Helena, noticed the toll. She'd married a watchmaker's son who loved precision for its own sake. Now she lived with a man who barely slept, who spent every spare shilling on metal and testing, who carried the weight of imagined casualties like a physical burden. "You're killing yourself for people who don't want to be saved," she said gently one evening in August. "I'm trying to save people who don't know they need it yet. And if they never listen?" Bergman didn't have an answer. The first real vindication came from an unexpected source. A German military observer named Otto Skorzeny visited Steyr in September 1933, ostensibly on industrial liaison business. In reality, he'd heard rumors about the MP34 and wanted to see it himself. Bergman demonstrated the weapon personally: rapid fire, controlled bursts, magazine changes, endurance. Skorzeny watched with the intensity of a man who understood exactly what he was seeing. When the demonstration ended, Skorzeny held the MP34 with something approaching reverence. "This weapon will change the blitzkrieg," he said quietly. "Fast infantry, suppressive fire, continuous advance. Whoever controls this technology controls the next war." The word sent ice through Bergman's chest. He'd built the MP34 to save lives, to give soldiers a tool that matched the war they'd actually fight, not the war doctrine pretended they'd fight. Now he was hearing it described as a weapon of conquest. "I built it for defense," Bergman said carefully. Skorzeny smiled, not unkindly, but with the certainty of someone who'd seen further down the road. "Herr Bergman," he said, "weapons don't know the difference." That night, Bergman couldn't sleep. He sat in the workshop, holding the MP34, feeling its weight and wondering what he'd actually created. "Do you think you'd fight the system for what you believe works, or accept what doctrine says is impossible? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real innovation stories from history. When the weapon you create to save lives becomes a tool for taking them, whose responsibility is it? The inventor's or history's? Winter returned to Steyr in late 1933, and with it came a quiet turning point that would change everything. Lieutenant Stefan Horvath, the skeptical observer from the endurance test, requested a private meeting. He arrived at the workshop after dark, nervous and determined. "I've been reassigned," he said without preamble. "Tank doctrine development. But before I go, I wanted you to know I submitted 3 separate reports recommending MP34 adoption. All were rejected, not on technical grounds, on political ones." Bergman wasn't surprised, but hearing it confirmed still stung. "Why are you telling me this?" Horvath pulled a folded document from his coat. "Because I made copies, technical specifications, test results, everything. If High Command won't listen now, maybe someone will later. Or maybe other forces will." The implication was clear. Austria was surrounded by nations rearming. Germany to the north, Italy to the south, tensions rising everywhere. "You're suggesting I sell to foreign militaries?" "I'm suggesting," Horvath said carefully, "that good engineering shouldn't die because of bad politics. What you do with that is your choice." After Horvath left, Bergman showed the documents to Schmeisser and Janicek. The 3 men sat in silence, understanding the crossroads they'd reached. "We could approach the Czechs," Janicek said quietly. "My contacts in Brno would be interested." "Or the British," Schmeisser added. "They're experimenting with submachine guns, but haven't settled on a design." Bergman stared at the MP34, its steel reflecting the workshop's dim light. "If we sell to foreign militaries and Austria finds out, we'll be charged with treason." "If we don't," Schmeisser said, "someone else will perfect the concept. And Austrian soldiers will face enemy submachine guns without equivalent weapons." The logic was brutal and inescapable. They chose a middle path, continued civilian sales and police contracts in Austria, but quiet technical consultations with foreign observers. Nothing that crossed into treason, but everything that kept the MP34 alive and evolving. The breakthrough came not from politics, but from engineering. In January 1934, during extreme cold weather testing in the Alps, the MP34 failed catastrophically. After 500 rounds in -20-degree conditions, the bolt mechanism froze solid. Bergman nearly wept with frustration, but failure taught them what success couldn't. Janček discovered that the lubricant they'd been using, standard gun oil, became viscous in extreme cold. He experimented with different formulations, finally settling on a synthetic blend that stayed fluid even in alpine winter. More important, the failure forced them to redesign the bolt carrier entirely. Schmeisser simplified the mechanism, reducing parts from 17 to 11, each with wider tolerances that allowed function even with debris or ice. The redesigned MP34, what they privately called the MP34-2, was tested in February 1934 in conditions that would have destroyed the original. It functioned flawlessly. "This is it," Bergman said, holding the new version. "This is the final form." "Until the next improvement," Schmeisser said with rare humor. "No, this is enough. Any more refinement, and we're chasing perfection past utility." It was a lesson his watchmaker father had taught him. Knowing when to stop is as important as knowing when to start. Spring 1934 brought new complications. The Austrian government, increasingly authoritarian under Chancellor Dollfuss, began restricting private weapons development. The Steyr facility came under closer scrutiny. Foreign observers were discouraged. But quietly, interest in the MP34 was growing. Police forces in 3 Austrian cities had adopted it. Czechoslovakia purchased technical specifications. Even elements within the Austrian military, younger officers who'd actually fought in the Great War, began advocating for reconsideration. The institutional resistance was cracking. Slowly. Too slowly. Bergman turned 44 that spring. He looked older. The years of late nights, technical obsession, and emotional weight showed in grey hair and deep lines around his eyes. Helena worried about his health. He worried about being right too late. "How long can you fight for something everyone says is impossible?" she asked one evening. "Until it becomes possible, or I die trying." And if both happen? Bergman had no answer. The moment that would validate everything came in June 1934, though they didn't recognize it at the time. Austrian border guards in Tyrol encountered armed smugglers using Italian Beretta submachine guns. The guards, equipped with standard Mannlicher rifles, were outgunned at close range. 2 guards were killed before the smugglers escaped. The incident report reached high command. Buried in bureaucratic language was a single damning sentence: "Current infantry armament proved inadequate for close-quarters engagement against automatic weapons." Lieutenant Horvath, now in tank development but still watching from the periphery, sent Bergman a copy of the report with 3 words attached: "They're starting to listen." It wasn't vindication yet. But it was the first crack in doctrine's armor, the moment when reality began to matter more than pride. Bergman stood in the workshop that evening, holding the MP34 the Seku, and allowed himself to hope. The vindication Theodor Bergman had fought years to achieve came in a form he'd never anticipated, necessity overriding doctrine so completely that pride became irrelevant. July 1934 brought the Austrian Civil War. 4 days of street fighting in Vienna that exposed every flaw in conventional infantry tactics. Government forces armed with Mannlicher rifles faced socialist militia in urban combat, where range meant nothing and rate of fire meant everything. Police units equipped with the MP34 proved devastatingly effective. In room-clearing operations, in street barricades, in the close-quarters chaos of urban warfare, the submachine gun's advantages became undeniable. After-action reports flooded into high command. Officers praised the weapon's reliability, controllability, psychological impact. General Kienberg, the same man who'd dismissed the MP34 as a toy, personally requested a meeting with Bergmann in August. The meeting room at Austrian High Command was the same one where Bergmann had been dismissed 18 months earlier. Kienberg looked older, tired. The Civil War had aged everyone. "Herr Bergmann," the general began, his voice careful, "recent events have demonstrated that infantry doctrine requires revision." Bergmann said nothing, waited. "The MP34 performed exceptionally in Vienna. We are prepared to authorize limited military trials with infantry units." Limited trials. After 2,000 rounds of endurance testing, after 3 years of refinement, after men had already died, proving what Bergmann had known all along. "With respect, General," Bergmann said quietly, "limited trials were what I requested in 1933. What the Austrian military needs now is full evaluation and rapid adoption, because the next war won't wait for doctrine to catch up." Kienberg's jaw tightened. "The next war? You know it's coming, sir. Germany is rearming. Italy is rearming. Austria's caught between them with an army equipped for 1914. The MP34 isn't a luxury, it's survival." The silence stretched. Finally, Kienberg nodded. "Full evaluation, 6-month timeline. If results support adoption, we proceed to production contracts." It was victory. Partial, grudging, years late, but victory. Walking out of high command, Bergmann felt no triumph. Only exhaustion and the weight of time wasted while institutional pride delayed the inevitable. The military trials began in September 1934. Infantry companies in Tyrol and Styria received MP342 weapons for field testing. Live fire exercises, cold weather operations, extended marches, tactical scenarios. The reports were unanimous. The MP34 represented a fundamental shift in infantry capability. Soldiers loved it. Officers recognized its tactical value. Even skeptics acknowledged that in close combat, one submachine gun equaled multiple rifles. By March 1935, the Austrian military authorized production contracts. Steyr would manufacture the MP34 for military issue. Bergmann's weapon, refined through years of rejection, perfected in workshop solitude, vindicated by reality's brutal clarity, became official. But vindication carried costs Bergmann hadn't anticipated. The first production run of military MP34s was designated for infantry and mountain troops. 500 weapons, delivered in batches through summer 1935. Bergmann inspected each one personally, checking tolerances, testing mechanisms, ensuring every weapon met the standards he'd fought to establish. Holding a production model felt different from holding the prototypes. This wasn't experimentation anymore. This was real. These weapons would be carried into combat, fired in anger, used to kill. "You should feel proud," Schmeisser said one evening as they watched another batch roll off production lines. "I feel responsible," Bergmann replied. The second cost came in 1936, recognition without control. As the MP34 gained recognition in Austrian military circles, foreign interest intensified. German observers visited Steyr repeatedly. Italian military delegations requested technical briefings. The weapon Bergmann had built to defend Austria was becoming a commodity in the European arms market. When Nazi Germany pressured Austria for production licenses, Bergmann understood he was losing control of his creation. "We can refuse," Janacek said during an urgent meeting. "And they'll copy it anyway," Schmeisser countered. "At least licensing gives us some oversight." "Oversight?" Bergmann's voice was bitter. "We'd be teaching them how to build weapons they'll use to conquer Europe." But the decision wasn't his to make. Steyr's management, under government pressure, signed licensing agreements. Technical specifications flowed north to Germany. The MP34's refinements would influence the MP38 and MP40, weapons that would arm Wehrmacht troops in Poland, France, Russia. Bergmann watched his life's work become a tool of conquest and felt each compromise like a physical wound. The third cost was personal. Helena had supported his obsession for years, through poverty and doubt and sleepless nights, but success brought different pressures. Bergman traveled constantly: production oversight, military consultations, technical conferences. He was recognized now, respected, sought after, but he was also absent, consumed not by the dream of creation anymore, but by the machinery of production and the weight of consequences. "You won," Helena said one night in late 1936. "Why don't you look like someone who won?" "Because I didn't win," Bergman said quietly. "I was just proven right. And being right doesn't feel the way I thought it would." The final crushing blow came in March 1938. The Anschluss, Nazi Germany's annexation of Austria, happened with brutal efficiency. German troops marched into Vienna. The Austrian government collapsed. Overnight, Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation. Steyerwerke was immediately nationalized under German control. The MP34 production lines, the designs, the expertise, everything Bergman had built became property of the Third Reich. Bergman himself was retained at the factory, not as an innovator anymore, but as a technical consultant, a prisoner of his own expertise, forced to oversee production of weapons for a regime he despised. When the first shipment of German-produced MP34s left Steyr, bound for Wehrmacht armories, Bergman stood in the empty workshop where it had all begun and wept. The years between 1938 and 1945 passed in a blur of production quotas, forced consultations, and silent complicity. Theodor Bergman remained at Steyr throughout the war. His expertise too valuable for the Germans to waste, his resistance too quiet to merit execution. He refined manufacturing processes, solved production bottlenecks, improved quality control, all while knowing every weapon he helped perfect would be used in conquest. The MP34 and its German descendants armed troops in Poland's invasion, in France, in the Balkans, in Russia's frozen hell. Every battlefield report was a knife in Bergman's conscience. Schmeisser had fled to Switzerland in 1939, escaping before borders closed. Janicek disappeared into Czechoslovakia's underground resistance and was never heard from again. Bergman stayed. Whether from paralysis, duty, or the terrible inertia of guilt, he was never sure. Helena died in 1943 during an Allied bombing raid on Vienna. Bergman was at Steyr when it happened. He received the news via telegram, returned for the funeral, and went back to work. There was nothing else to do. Stopping wouldn't bring her back. Stopping wouldn't undo the weapons already built. The war ended in May 1945. Steyr fell to American forces. Bergman was interrogated, cleared of war crimes, and released, a technical specialist who'd worked under duress, not a collaborator who'd worked by choice. The distinction felt meaningless to him. Post-war Austria was a shattered landscape of rubble and memory. Bergman returned to Vienna, to an apartment empty of everything but ghosts. He was 55 years old, exhausted, and carrying a burden that wouldn't lift. For years, he worked odd jobs, repairing clocks, teaching mathematics, anything that didn't involve weapons. He avoided publicity, refused interviews, wanted only to be forgotten. But history had other plans. In 1952, a young military historian named David Kellerman tracked Bergman down, researching the development of submachine guns for a doctoral thesis. He wanted to interview the man behind the MP34. Bergman initially refused, then relented, perhaps sensing that silence wouldn't erase the past, only ensure it was misunderstood. The interview took place in a small cafe in Vienna's 7th district, autumn light slanting through windows. "You revolutionized infantry tactics," Kellerman said, notebook open. "The MP34's impact on modern warfare is incalculable. Don't you feel proud of that achievement?" Bergman was silent for a long moment, stirring coffee he wouldn't drink. "Pride? No. I feel responsible. There's a difference. But you saved lives. Austrian soldiers, police, mountain troops, they survived battles because of your weapon. And Polish civilians died. French soldiers died. Russian conscripts died. Because the same weapon was used by people I never intended to arm. That's not your fault. You can't control how technology is used once it exists. Bergman looked at the young historian with tired eyes. That's what everyone says. It's a comfortable lie. The truth is, once you create something, you're responsible for what it becomes. Not legally, maybe, but morally. Absolutely. Kellerman's thesis, published in 1954, treated the MP34 with proper technical and historical respect. But it also included Bergman's words, the burden, the doubt, the cost of innovation. It didn't make Bergman famous, but it ensured he wouldn't be forgotten. The twist that brought the story full circle came in 1961, when a museum curator in Salzburg contacted Bergman about donating his original MP34 prototype for a military history exhibition. Bergman hadn't seen the prototype in decades. He'd assumed it was destroyed, lost in the chaos of war and occupation. But it had survived, discovered in a Steyr warehouse, still functional, still bearing the serial number he'd engraved by hand in 1933. The museum visit took place in November 1961. Bergman stood in front of a glass case, looking at the weapon he'd created 28 years earlier. It looked smaller than he remembered, simpler. Just metal and springs, and the crystallized obsession of a younger man who'd believed being right mattered most. The curator, an earnest woman in her 30s, spoke about the MP34's historical significance, its technical innovations, its influence on modern firearms. Bergman listened politely. When she finished, he asked a question. "Do you know how many people were killed with weapons based on this design?" She hesitated, uncomfortable. The historical record is incomplete. Tens of thousands, certainly. Perhaps hundreds of thousands across all variants and derivative models. Bergman nodded slowly. "And do you know how many would have died without it? Would Austrians have survived invasions if they'd only had rifles? Would police have stopped violent criminals? Would Allied forces in late war operations have succeeded without submachine guns?" The curator had no answer. "The problem," Bergman said quietly, "is that both numbers are real, both matter. And I carry both." He died 2 years later in 1963 at age 73. A small obituary in the Wiener Zeitung noted his passing, mentioning his work on the MP34 in a single sentence. Most readers didn't know who he was, but veterans remembered. Officers who'd carried MP34s in the mountains, police who'd used them in Vienna, even some former Wehrmacht soldiers, old men now, who'd carried the MP40 and knew it descended from Austrian engineering. They remembered the weapon. Few remembered the man. The final irony came decades later, in the 1980s, when military historians reassessing World War II innovation concluded that the MP34's greatest legacy wasn't tactical, it was doctrinal. The weapon had forced military institutions across Europe to acknowledge that doctrine must adapt to reality, not the other way around. That institutional pride couldn't override battlefield truth. That being right mattered more than being believed, and that the cost of ignoring innovators was measured in lives. Bergman never knew about that assessment. He died carrying the weight of being right without feeling the vindication he'd once imagined. In the end, the MP34 sits in museums across Europe, Salzburg, Vienna, Prague, Berlin. Cold steel behind glass, a technical achievement preserved in silence. But it's not the weapon that matters. It's the lesson it carries. That changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you. That innovation demands sacrifice. That vindication comes late, if it comes at all. And that the minds behind weapons, the engineers, the obsessives, the people who see what needs to exist, carry burdens that outlast steel. If this story reminded you that changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. The MP34 rusted and faded. But Theodore Bergman's question endures. When you create something powerful, who carries the weight of what it becomes? The inventor or history?